Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. This is the moment you've all been waiting for. This is the last lecture of the fall semester, the pandemic semester of 2020. And everyone did a great job, and it was such a pleasure and a privilege to be able to work with all of you and experience the good work that you've all done through the semester. So thank you for that. So today I'm addressing all 126 students, and that means that all of us in my three classes are going to share this lecture, and the classes are all different. For those of you who don't know, I teach U.S. history, so about 40 of you or 41 of you are in here from U.S. history, and then I teach two world history courses, one called Modern World and one called Contemporary World, and there is a difference between the two. And there's 40 or so in each one of those. So I'm doing something different today by doing one lecture. It's our final lecture, and I can do this because we're not going to get too much into specifics, but we're going to talk about the broader lessons of history. And as I went through the semester, and recently have been looking at some music and some other stuff, and I thought, I think we wasted about 15 or 16 weeks in here, because every week I'd make a lecture and I'd go through the readings and make all these reading notes, and you guys would work hard doing the readings, reviewing everything, writing your essays or doing your exams or quizzes. And we could have skipped all of that because I was just looking at an Eric Clapton song, and the song See What a Love Can Do. And I realized that I think Clapton summarizes everything we're supposed to take away from this history in these song lyrics. So the lyrics are, when the words are in the music and the music is the song, the world would be so happy if we'd all just get along. And I think that kind of is a good way to summarize everything that we've learned. And it's interesting because, the textbook and myself included, we tend to dwell on the negatives sometimes in history. And I think the reason we do that is because it helps us understand our world and what's going on today. One of my great professors when I was in grad school, always said about history that, the present is the unfolding past. So again, this idea of connection. But I think that for a lot of us, that sounds like, more liberal academic BS. And so what do we mean by that? How does this idea that Clapton summarized in The World Would Be So Happy If We'd All Just Get Along, how did that manifest itself in some of the histories that we've talked about? So because we're all here together, we're going to talk about little snippets of what we've learned, and I think hopefully we can understand this commonality. So if you're in my American history class right now, we're at the end of the class, of course, and we're studying Reconstruction. So this is that period of time after the Civil War ends when the country needs to come back together. And there are really two different buckets to Reconstruction. One bucket is this idea of getting the states back together and getting the federal government back together. And, how are we sure that the South is going to be loyal to the Constitution and loyalty oaths and all that stuff? So that's one bucket. But the other bucket is the race part. And, when we think about the race part, and if you've been in my class this semester, it's the only thing you've heard about probably. But when we think about the race part, when we look at that time called Reconstruction in that period of time after the Civil War, it was almost working. In other words, and I, you can't sum this up in 3 minutes, but in other words, after the Civil War, what was going to happen in those southern states? Was racism and discrimination and disenfranchisement going to be just a little better when African Americans were enslaved, or is the aspirational promise of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment going to be realized? In other words, are freed African Americans going to be able to vote? Are they going to have violence thrust against them? What's going to happen? And so that was the case, but there was a group called the Radical Republicans who really wanted more, wanted things like land redistribution, and wanted clear voting rights and all of the rights and privileges of a United States citizen to apply to everybody. And so for a period of time after the Civil War, with the Republicans and with military districts in the South, this radical Reconstruction was taking place. And during that time, it was everything was policed, everything was overseen. So you had freed slaves, African Americans voting. You had African Americans in state governments and in the federal government in some cases. So that was really working, and it was working really well because people were trying to get along, and there was tolerance to reintegrate or to integrate, I guess, people of color back into this American society after the Civil War, and it worked okay until 1877. And not to get into details, but there was something called the corrupt bargain, and basically the Republicans agreed that if Rutherford B. Hayes became president, then they would pull out of the South. And when they did that, and the Democratic Party of the South took back over again, then you saw things go back to almost where they were right at the end of the Civil War. So you saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, you saw the emergence of black codes and different ways of disenfranchising blacks through poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and what have you. And that's the way it was up until, all the way, I would argue, up until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this disenfranchisement and this continued racism and discrimination, goes on to today. I mean, you can trace it all the way to George Floyd's murder. Goes on to today because of the failures of the federal government and the failures of the country to come together to make sure that Reconstruction happened, and that all of those aspirational thoughts that are embodied in the 14th and 15th Amendments, especially, could really make things better, could really change things, and could really get us on the road to civil rights, which didn't happen. But the whole point is, when we reflect on that and we go back to Eric Clapton, the world would be so happy if we could all just get along. I mean, obviously, it was a lack of tolerance on the part of the Southern whites and the Northern whites, and still this idea that people of color were the other after the Civil War, and it goes on and on and on and on today. But I think, your generation's a lot better than ours was. So there's that part, and again, this theme in American history is, us versus them, black versus white, Republicans versus Democrat, always trying to put people in a one way or the other. They're the other, and we're never going to get along, and vice versa. So, it led to all the violence in Selma and everything else that actually we haven't studied in our class because we're older, American history, but again, it's all there. So there's that part in American history, and in modern or contemporary world history, we were studying the Middle East and ferment in the Middle East, and, you might be thinking, I don't understand the Middle East. How come no one gets along there? And there's lots of reasons for that. It's not that the people are different or better or worse, or it's circumstances. It's historical circumstances. So after World War I, these great old empires like the Ottoman Empire falls after 800 years in existence, and there's a big change and a new modern, for all practical purposes, a new modern government comes in to Turkey, which is sort of the core of that area, and all of a sudden you get these divides between traditional Muslims and more modern Muslims, and you get divides between Sunnis and Shiites. And so, again, this is an example of intolerance of religion. And also in the Middle East after World War II, 1947, when Israel is, carved out, the Palestinians aren't happy about that. It's, arguing over whose homeland it is and who deserves to live where. And again, it's this intolerance that we see between Palestinians and Jews, and between Muslims and Christians, and Muslims and Christians and Christians. So, we see this all through history. Again, this lack of ability to tolerate others and to classify others as all bad or all good. All Jews are bad, all Jews are good, all Muslims are bad, all Muslims are good. And, we don't want to make that mistake in our thinking. We want to understand, hey, not all of anybody is one thing. It's not like that. There's a great diversity within groups, and our differences are a lot less than what we have in common, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So when we got into modern world history, I think the last one we studied was the Cold War, another instance of this idea that communists are not going to get along with the capitalist, and so the whole Cold War and all of the lives that are expended through proxy wars and everything else that's going on, all happens because we can't accept ideologies of different people, and we're not even willing to give a little bit. And in that case, as far as the social part goes, I mean, the U.S. and the USSR both did a really good job of brainwashing their people through propaganda that everything communist was bad, everything socialist was bad, and capitalism and good old democracy is the way to go. And the same in the Soviet Union, that the running dogs, the imperialist dogs, want to come in and exploit the resources and exploit the people because all they care about is making a profit. And that's what Marx said, and that's what we're doing. So again, this idea of intolerance between two groups. So I think, when we go back to Eric Clapton and we think about how he embodied this idea of the world could be so happy if we could all just get along, I think there's something to that. And, in these survey history classes, I mean, man, we cover the gambit from, 1500 to current, in 15 weeks, and we try to cover the whole world. So obviously we can't get too in depth in anything. And I think that if you're a student like I was, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I don't remember from any of my classes, maybe 4 weeks later. So the one thing I want you to remember is that all of these historical problems come about because of a lack of understanding and a lack of tolerance. And it's almost like history should be the playbook for diversity and inclusion. It's because everything we try to accomplish in diversity and inclusion, the reason we have to do that in the first place is because of the history and all of the bad things that came before, the exclusion, if you will. So I want you to walk away with that. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that as a voter. I want you to think about it as a student. Anytime you make a decision, make sure you understand that the world isn't black and white, that there's a lot of middle ground there, and the middle ground is where things happen. The middle ground is where we innovate, and when we get along together, we work in common to solve problems. Maybe a helpful example is you take whatever you're into. So if you're into politics, you have the Republicans and you have the Democrats, and many Democrats say, man, all the Republicans are terrible people. They want no regulation for industry. They want to disenfranchise voters, whatever. And Republicans are saying, boy, the Democrats are awful because they want to just tax, and they want to basically turn the U.S. into a socialist nation is sort of the thing. So, you can say that and you can look at that political divide, but it's important to understand that within these two groups, there's a broad range of people. So, not all Republicans are like, boy, we can't have any corporate regulation. There is a bell curve with everybody in what they believe. And within the Republican Party, probably a quarter of that bell curve overlaps with people in the Democratic Party because, again, there are very liberal Democrats and there are centrist, and there are very centrist Republicans and very right-wing Republicans. And that zone in the middle where they overlap, that's where things happen. So, it's not just politics in any of your. Okay, so if you're a Ohio State or a University of Michigan fan, oftentimes there's no love between those two groups. It's like all the Buckeyes fans are terrible and all the Wolverines fans are great, or vice versa. And the reality of it is that all of the fans have a lot more in common than what separates them. Normally what separates them is just a little thing. And that's the case in history too. But we don't do a very good job of understanding and tolerating each other. So hopefully the message from these classes is that you need to tolerate others. You can do that today. Maybe one of the applications of this class is to do a random act of kindness for someone today. Hold a door open, or let someone out of their parking space. Let someone out, or let someone across the crosswalk with your car. So again, take something away from it. It's really about toleration, diversity, kindness, and getting along. And hopefully you've had a good semester. I know I have. I appreciate everything that you guys put up with me this semester. And again, if you've missed anything, you want to sort of take advantage of Dr. Dan's academic amnesty, give me a shout. And if you have any missing papers or anything that you haven't turned in, we can make that happen and get your grade back up to where it belongs. So that's it. Thanks again. You guys have been great. Have a great holiday. Stay safe. Wear your mask. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.